1941 began as a year of unchecked confidence for Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler, believing in the invincibility of his armies, saw the Soviet Union not as a formidable power, but as a paper tiger waiting to be crushed. "We have only to kick in the door," Hitler boasted, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Millions of men, thousands of tanks, and a Luftwaffe that dominated the skies were poised for what Hitler imagined would be a swift, decisive strike. The Wehrmacht's optimism was palpable. Victory seemed inevitable. Yet, the scale of what they were about to confront was unprecedented. The Soviet Union, vast, resource-rich, and fiercely determined, was a challenge far greater than Hitler's generals had anticipated. Within days of the invasion Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht began to realize that the Red Army would not crumble so easily. Supply lines stretched over hundreds of miles became a nightmare. The further the Germans advanced, the more the reality of logistical limitations gnawed at them. And in the east, the winter, a merciless force of nature, began to whisper its threats. Click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people discover this story. By the end of June 1941, the Germans had advanced hundreds of kilometers, capturing towns, railways, and cities. The Blitzkrieg tactic lightning war seemed unstoppable at first. Panzer divisions smashed through weakly defended positions. Infantry followed, and the Luftwaffe ensured aerial supremacy. But these early victories were deceptive. The Germans had underestimated the Soviets' ability to trade space for time. Entire Red Army units, though battered, retreated in an organized fashion, setting the stage for counter. In the vastness of the Soviet landscape, the German advance slowed, and the promise of a quick victory began to fade. The first major shock came in the swamps and forests of Belarus. Redman forces, accustomed to rapid victories, faced marshes, rivers, and unexpected partisan activity that delayed supply convoys and created confusion. Equipment meant for swift movement broke down under poor conditions, and fuel shortages became increasingly critical. By the autumn of 1941, the situation worsened. The Wehrmacht approached Moscow, but frost and mud slowed their advance. Soviet reinforcements, fresh from Siberia and the Far East, poured into defensive positions. Hitler, growing impatient, demanded a final push. His orders disregarded reality, emphasizing ideology over logistics. The fourth paragraph brought a sudden twist. German intelligence reported that Soviet forces were organizing reserves twice the size anticipated, hidden behind the forests and plains that stretched endlessly toward Moscow. The Wehrmacht faced a dilemma: press on and risk encirclement, or pause and reorganize, giving the Soviets time to recover. Every decision became a gamble with consequences that would ripple for years to come. By late November, the first heavy snow fell, catching unprepared German units by surprise. Soldiers suffered frostbite, horses and vehicles stalled, and the legendary Blitzkrieg momentum halted. Meanwhile, Stalin's defenders, hardened by the winter and inspired by propaganda and sheer survival instinct, counterattacked sporadically, slowing the German advance further. Civilians endured relentless bombardments, yet many refused to flee, choosing instead to aid the Soviet cause. The city streets, rail depots, and factories became makeshift fortresses. The sixth paragraph introduced another cliffhanger. As Hitler demanded a final offensive toward Moscow, German generals began whispering warnings of disaster. Some advocated withdrawal to consolidate supply lines. Others, fearing Hitler's wrath, remained silent. Would the Reich push forward blindly into winter, or recognize that their overconfidence might cost them the Eastern Front entirely? By December, the situation crystallized. Operation Barbarossa, intended as a 6-week campaign, had stretched into a grueling 6-month ordeal. German soldiers were exhausted, equipment was failing, and winter raged mercilessly. Moscow remained unconquered. Hitler's ideological war, designed to humiliate and destroy, had instead revealed the vast logistical and strategic limitations of Germany's military machine. The initial illusion of Blitzkrieg had shattered, replaced by the grim reality of attrition and environmental hardship. Operation Barbarossa, in its early triumphs and subsequent struggles, set the stage for the next phase of Hitler's Eastern ambitions. The overreach, the underestimation of the enemy, and the brutal Russian winter foreshadowed the larger, bloodier struggles that would come in 1942, struggles that would test not just military strategy, but human endurance on a colossal scale. And yet, even in defeat, Hitler's plans were far from over. As a new objective loomed on the southern horizon, a campaign driven by oil, resources, and a stubborn refusal to accept reality. By early 1942, Hitler had accepted that Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver a decisive victory. Moscow remained out of reach, and the German army was fatigued, stretched across an enormous front. But the Führer's ambitions were far from quelled. He turned his eyes south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the fertile plains of Ukraine. Without control of these resources, Germany could not sustain its war effort, especially in the looming confrontation with the industrial giants of the Allies. The stakes had never been higher, and Hitler's obsession with resources would now dictate strategy. Operation Blau, or Case Blue as it was codenamed, was the embodiment of this ambition. Army Group South, which had already been strained during Barbarossa, was divided into two prongs. Army Group A would push south to seize the oil fields of Maka, Grozny, and Baku, securing the lifeblood of the German war machine. Army Group B, meanwhile, was tasked with the strategic objective of taking Stalingrad, cutting off the Volga River supply line, and denying the Soviets access to critical transport routes. At first glance, the plan appeared flawless. By controlling oil and transportation, Germany could sustain its campaigns, crippling the Soviet economy and military at once. Yet, from the outset, cracks began to appear. Logistics became the first and most persistent adversary. The distances involved were enormous. Railways and roads inadequate for moving men, tanks, and supplies efficiently. Fuel shortages plagued the panzers, and the Axis allies, primarily Romanian and Italian divisions, lacked the training, equipment, and morale necessary to hold the flanks or face determined Soviet counters. Each day of delay allowed the Soviets to reinforce defensive lines, consolidate troops, and prepare for the inevitable clash. By mid-August, Army Group A finally reached the outskirts of the oil fields. The sight should have been one of triumph. Instead, they were met with the shocking reality of scorched earth tactics. Soviet engineers had deliberately destroyed drilling infrastructure, pipelines, and storage facilities. The oil fields that were to power Hitler's war were reduced to charred, unusable wastelands. German soldiers, exhausted and already overstretched, could hardly believe the magnitude of the setback. Victory, which had seemed assured at the campaign's launch, now felt elusive. The fourth paragraph delivered a sharp twist. While Army Group A grappled with the empty oil, the Sixth Army's advance toward Stalingrad was slowing to a crawl. Every street and factory became a fortress, defended by a combination of Soviet troops and civilian militias who refused to yield. Hitler's plan, ambitious and meticulously orchestrated on paper, was rapidly unraveling on the ground. The dream of a swift, decisive conquest was slipping through German fingers, and yet the Führer's orders remained unyielding, demanding progress regardless of cost. Urban warfare in Stalingrad quickly became a nightmare. The city, already a symbol of Soviet pride, offered natural fortifications. Rubble-strewn streets, destroyed buildings, and makeshift barricades gave defenders a significant advantage. Snipers, booby traps, and ambushes turned every block into a battlefield. German commanders, trained for rapid maneuvers, found themselves bogged down in slow, grinding fights. The closer they got to the city center, the more deadly and unpredictable the resistance became. And outside the city, the Soviet 62nd Army began to prepare for a defense that would exhaust every German resource and test every strategic assumption. A third cliffhanger emerges. While Hitler's forces battled for intelligence reports hinted at massive Soviet reinforcements, moving toward the city, fresh divisions from Siberia and reserves previously unseen. Could the German army, already stretched thin and lacking supplies, withstand the sheer weight of what was approaching? And in the south, Army Group A's lack of fuel and damaged equipment threatened to stall the drive toward the Caucasus entirely. The campaign that promised to secure Germany's future was now teetering on the edge of disaster. Pilate, Sumer. The picture became grim. Axis forces were overextended, flanks vulnerable, and coordination faltering. The terrain itself was unforgiving. Rivers, mountains, and urban ruins slowed advances, while partisan attacks on supply lines compounded logistical woes. Hitler's insistence on dictating operational decisions from Berlin added further strain, leaving field commanders unable to adapt to the rapidly changing battlefield. What had begun as a calculated, resource-driven campaign had become a desperate struggle to maintain momentum. The Soviet response, meanwhile, grew more sophisticated. Defensive lines were strengthened, reserves positioned to counter German advances, and propaganda reinforced civilian resistance. Stalingrad's factories, railways, and urban neighborhoods transformed into fortresses, where even the smallest Soviet units could inflict disproportionate losses. The German army faced not just an enemy of men and tanks, but an entire city turned into a lethal trap. The cost of continuing the campaign would be measured not only in military losses, but in human suffering that would echo through history. Operation Blau, intended to secure resources and strategic advantage, had exposed the vulnerability at the core of Hitler's strategy. Overambition, overconfidence, and an underestimation of Soviet resilience. While the Germans pushed forward, the Soviets prepared for the inevitable clash that would define the Eastern Front in 19 battle that would test the limits of planning, courage, and survival on both sides. The stage was set for Stalingrad, a confrontation that would eclipse all previous engagements in scale, ferocity, and consequence. Stalingrad, a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Beevor, in 1942, as the focal point of Hitler's southern ambitions. To the German high command, it was a strategic jewel. Securing the city would cut Soviet supply lines along the Volga and protect the flank of the drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Yet, for the men on the ground, Stalingrad was a labyrinth of rubble, factories, and narrow streets, where every corner could conceal a sniper, a machine gun nest, or a trap. The Germans entered the city with confidence, but the Soviet defenders were waiting, ready to turn the rubble into a weapon far deadlier than any tank or artillery shell. Click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people see this story. The Germans initially tried to replicate the blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so well in the West, and during the early stages of but Stalingrad offered no open fields to sweep across with panzers and mechanized infantry. Urban warfare was unforgiving. The 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Chukov, a veteran of the Winter War against Finland, adopted a simple but devastating strategy: hug the enemy. Soviet troops remained perilously close to German lines, forcing the attackers to risk friendly fire and limiting the effectiveness of artillery and air support. Every street, factory, and building became a fortress. German divisions, exhausted from months of campaigning, found themselves in a grinding battle that drained men, morale, and material. The first cliffhanger. As the German Sixth Army pressed deeper into intelligence suggested that a massive Soviet counteroffensive was gathering beyond the city, threatening to cut off their supply lines and encircle them. Every advance deeper into the ruins came with the shadow of potential annihilation looming behind it. Could Hitler's forces hold the ground they had fought so hard to capture? The fighting was merciless. Snipers turned the city into a deadly game of cat and mouse, targeting officers and engineers alike. Mines and booby traps lurked in collapsed buildings. Civilians, either trapped or determined to resist, aided the Soviet army, hiding supplies, guiding soldiers through labyrinthine ruins, and even engaging in acts of sabotage against the Germans. Each day, the Wehrmacht gained yards at a horrific cost. Tanks became vulnerable in streets too narrow to maneuver, while artillery shells often caused more chaos for German troops than for their targets. As weeks passed, the initial optimism faded into grim, exhausted determination. The second cliffhanger. With winter still months away, reports came that the Soviet 62nd Army was receiving reinforcements and supplies via the Volga, sustaining a defense that seemed almost endless. How long could the Germans continue to push forward without facing a catastrophic counter? The soldiers could feel the noose tightening around them, though few dared speak it aloud. By September, the Germans occupied much of the western portion of the city, but the Soviets held the eastern quarters, factories, and key rail depots. Urban combat slowed to a crawl, with entire weeks spent clearing single blocks. Street after street became a death trap, where a single misstep could cost dozens of men. Morale among German troops wavered as the promised quick victory dissolved into endless, bloody attrition. The very tactics that had defined the Wehrmacht's early success, the coordinated use of tanks, infantry, and air support, were ineffective in the maze of destroyed streets and buildings. The third cliffhanger emerges. As Hitler demanded that Stalingrad be taken at all costs, Soviet engineers were preparing elaborate defensive measures that would turn the German advance into a perilous gamble. Mines, barricades, hidden bunkers, and sniper nests awaited, and the Red Army's tenacity was far from exhausted. The Germans had entered the inferno, but little did they know that the fire was far from under control, and the coming months would test every ounce of their strength, endurance, and strategy. Meanwhile, outside the city, the logistical challenges of maintaining an overextended front grew worse with each passing day. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to partisan attacks and Soviet counterstrikes. German units, isolated and low on ammunition, faced the cruel reality that reinforcement could be delayed or blocked entirely. In Stalingrad, victory would not be measured in territory alone, but in the staggering human cost paid in blood and resolve. The Battle of Stalingrad had begun in earnest. What was supposed to be a decisive strike became a grinding, brutal campaign, where every building and street became a battlefield. For Hitler, the stakes were strategic and symbolic. For the soldiers, it was survival, and for the civilians, it was endurance amidst destruction. Stalingrad would not just test military tactics, it would redefine the very limits of war itself, a grim prelude to the even greater horrors and triumphs that awaited in the campaigns to come. By October 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had escalated into a grinding nightmare. What Hitler had imagined as a swift conquest had transformed into a brutal stalemate. The German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich von Paulus, was locked in relentless combat against an enemy who refused to yield. Every street, factory, and block required meticulous clearing, costing hundreds of lives daily. Two Wehrmacht's famed panzers, designed for rapid breakthroughs, were often reduced to vulnerable targets amid rubble-strewn streets, while Soviet T-34 tanks, with sloped armor and superior maneuverability, dominated open sectors, proving the limits of German armored supremacy. Outside the city, German logistical nightmares intensified. Railways could not adequately supply the front, and every additional kilometer of advance stretched fuel, ammunition, and food even thinner. Soldiers scrounged for supplies, often relying on what they could carry from fallen comrades or captured stockpiles. Meanwhile, the Soviets, resilient and resourceful, continuously reinforced their positions across the Volga. Supplies, reinforcements, and weapons flowed into the city with a speed and efficiency the Germans could scarcely disrupt. The first cliffhanger strikes early. Whispers of a massive Soviet counteroffensive Operation Barbarossa reached the German lines. Stalin's plan was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Encircle and destroy the Sixth Army before it could retreat or receive reinforcements. For German commanders, the idea seemed almost impossible. Yet, the Soviets had been meticulously preparing, exploiting weak points along Axis flanks held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian divisions. Could the Germans detect the threat before it was too late, or were they walking into a trap that would change the course of the war? Inside Stalingrad, fighting intensified in a labyrinth of ruins. German soldiers, despite superior training, were worn down by constant harassment from Soviet snipers and night attacks. Even artillery and airstrikes offered limited relief. As Soviet troops hugged the enemy, forcing Germans into close-quarters combat, civilians, though suffering unimaginably, continued to aid the defenders, moving food, intelligence, and even small arms through the Ruble. Each day was a battle for survival, and morale among German troops began to fracture under the combined weight of starvation, exhaustion, and relentless enemy pressure. The second cliffhanger appears as winter approaches. With temperatures dropping below freezing, both sides faced not only combat, but the brutal Russian winter. Frostbite, disease, and deprivation became as lethal as bullets. The German command underestimated the environment once again, and the soldiers began to feel the crushing weight of overreach. Would the Sixth Army withstand the dual threat of Soviet forces and a merciless winter? Or was this the beginning of an irreversible decline? By November, the situation became critical. Operation Uranus was launched with devastating effect. Soviet forces struck the weaker flanks of the Axis armies, breaking through Romanian and Italian positions with astonishing speed. Encirclement became inevitable. Communications faltered, and German divisions found themselves trapped within a tightening pocket, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. Desperate requests for resupply by air provided only minimal relief, and Hitler's refusal to allow retreat sealed the fate of the encircled forces. The third cliffhanger. The Germans, despite their technological advantages and disciplined training, faced starvation and mounting casualties. Soviet troops pressed relentlessly, using cunning, local knowledge, and sheer numbers to tighten the noose. Could the Sixth Army find a way out of the trap, or was Stalingrad about to become a tomb for Hitler's ambitions in the East? By December 1942, the full consequences of German overreach were undeniable. Army Group A, bogged down in the Caucasus, could not relieve the encircled Sixth Army. Hitler's insistence on divided objectives, oil in the south and Stalingrad in the north, had spread his forces thin. Soviet resilience, strategic planning, and adaptability proved superior to German calculations. The Battle of Stalingrad had transformed from an offensive into a crucible, revealing the limits of German military power and the ability of the Soviet Union to endure, adapt, and counter it. The stage was now set for one of history's most decisive turning points. Stalingrad became more than a city. It was a symbol of endurance, strategy, and the harsh realities of modern warfare. Hegemonie, hubris, logistical overextension, and underestimation of both the Soviet army and the Russian environment had culminated in a scenario that would redefine the Eastern Front and foreshadow the eventual German retreat across the vast Soviet landscape. The horrors endured by soldiers and civilians alike underscored a grim truth. No military machine, however formidable, could overcome a determined adversary without careful planning, realistic objectives, and respect for the unforgiving conditions of war. Operation Blau, Stalingrad, and the brutal lessons of 1942 would echo throughout the remainder of World War II, highlighting the resilience of the Soviet Union and marking the beginning of the decline of Hitler's Eastern ambitions. The battle lines were drawn, the survivors counted their losses, and the world watched as the tide slowly turned.